All right, guys. Last lesson before Feliz Navidad. Um, this is our last industrialization lesson as far as processes of industrialization go. Now, one of the things that we've talked about is how industrialization occurs. And there's a very important thing to know about industrialization, like Britain, and in places like the United States and Germany and France. And that is industrialization began and grew in the private sector. Private individuals and private companies started factories, created inventions that'll facilitate industrialization, came up with new financial practices. It wasn't an instance where the government built a factory and the government was hiring workers and the government was actively an active force in the process of taking their country from non-industrial to industrialized. However, there will be two places where the government will actually begin industrialization. And these two places are Russia and Japan. And what happens in both of these places is industrialization in Western Europe, Britain, France, United States, and we're going to include the United States, Germany, and we're going to include the United States in this because Western, even though not Western Europe, by like 1840, they had industrialization and it was going and it was humming and it was changing their entire societies. Well, in the late 19th century, two states that are not industrialized realized that their economies were falling behind. And they also realized that private individuals in their country did not have the capital and did not have the know-how to industrialize. So what you're going to see in these two places is state-sponsored industrialization, where it will become a government policy to make the state industrialized. And that's going to be very different than what we see in the other places. And it's going to have some very, very different impacts. The two states that are going to have state-sponsored industrialization are going to be Japan and Russia. So we need to look at, well, what happens in both of these places and what are the things besides being state-sponsored that make them unique. So we're going to start off with Japan. Japan's really important starting in this class going forward. Hold on just a second. That was funny. Sorry, my internet started playing the video. Japan's was really important to our story from this point forward. We know that early on in our next period, they're going to be involved in World War II. And yet we're halfway through period 3 and we've barely talked about them. Why is that? Because for most of period 3, Japan is completely not influential. They are neither having relationships with other people or not much of a relationship with other people, and other people are not coming to them. For the first half of period 3, Japan is still controlled by the Takagawa Shogunate. Japan was still having the traditional ways of life. The Takagawa Shogunate back in period 2, we had said, had conquered all of Japan, and the shogun was ruling Japan basically as an absolute leader. Remember, we don't say absolute monarch because that's reference to a Christian ideal, but an absolute leader. They still have feudalism. Most of the people in Japanese society were serfs. And then you had a middle warrior class of people like samurai and the nobles who were daimyo. It was the same way in 1850 as it was in 1605 for the most part. Limited outside interactions, and Japan was just kind of doing its own thing. But what has happened in period 3 is as Europe is globalizing, continuing to globalize from after period 2, and now powers are industrializing. Japan has fallen farther and farther and farther and farther behind. And one of the big themes that we're going to talk about when we get back from Christmas and start looking at the rest of this time period in January is the industrial powers are also going to be the powers that build empires, and they're going to build these empires globally. And one of two things happens in this period. You are either an industrial wolf using your massive amounts of resources and weapons and global reach to colonize vast parts of the world, or you are a non-industrialized sheep basically just waiting for the wolves to come and eat you and to quite literally tear you apart. Well, in 1850, actually 1854, the first wolf shows up on Japan's doorstep. And that wolf is the United States of America. The United States was a growing industrial power, and we were a growing naval power. And we're starting to build our own empire globally. And we'll talk about the American Empire in period 3 after Christmas. Well, in 1854, an American admiral named Matthew Perry, excuse me, sons of my eyes, named Matthew Perry is going to come into Tokyo Harbor, into the capital of Tokyo, quite literally with guns blazing. Now, if you remember from period 2, the Japanese basically kill anybody who's a foreigner who's in Japan, except in Hiroshima, where they allowed the Dutch to have a trade post. And that was an easy part to contain for them. The Americans show up with guns blazing and basically are like, hey, guess what? You guys are going to start trading with us. And it was quite literally at the point of a gun. And the Japanese are forced to sign a treaty with the United States, allowing the U.S. trade privileges in Tokyo itself. And it's not long after that that other European powers like the British forced the Japanese to sign treaties like that with them. The arrival of Matthew Perry in Japan, I would argue, is the most important moment in Japanese history, because Westerners have come in, industrial powers have come in, and some people in Japan look at each other and go, holy crap. If we don't start to reform our system really, really, really quickly, we're going to be taken over by these industrial powers. And right next door in China, this is happening. I'm going to give you the story of what happens to China in period 3 when we come back after Christmas. The wolves are tearing Japan apart. So Japan is hearing stories of what's coming in from China, and they're seeing it for themselves right now. But this is a constant theme in these places. Traditional groups of power in Japan, like what I told you with the Ottomans, and like what I told you in China from a previous lesson, are resistant to change because the existing economic, political, and most importantly, social systems are benefiting them. In lots of these non-Western regions, the traditional elites are against reform because they see it as a threat to their power. The shogun isn't interested in changing the system really at all. So you've got this group of reformers who are going, guys, we have to do something. And the traditional elites in Japan who are against this. In all the other countries, the reformers aren't successful. What makes Japan different from places like China and the Ottoman Empire is the reformers in Japan will ultimately be successful. The reformers in Japan in the 1860s are going to rally around a Japanese emperor named Meiji. Remember what I told you? Shoguns ruled. Yes, there was an emperor, but the emperor was just a figurehead. Reformers back Meiji in an attempt to end the iron grip of the Takagawa Shogunate and to assume power so that they can make the reforms they feel are necessary. Long story short, in the 1860s, at the exact same time that the American Civil War was being fought, Meiji's supporters start to fight against the forces of the shogun. They start a civil war in Japan in the 1860s, and Meiji's supporters win. And they're going to bring about an end to the Takagawa Shogunate in the 1860s. And what's going to happen now is, for the first time in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years in Japan, they're going to have an emperor who actually has some power. And Meiji and his supporters are going to attempt to reform and update the Japanese system before they get colonized. And what is the biggest reform that Japan is going to make? State-sponsored industrialization. They're going to try to industrialize and change their way of life like that. So, what are the reforms of Meiji, and how does Japan industrialize? Well, after they put an end to the Civil War, Meiji is going to free the peasants in Japanese society. You're like, oh, what a beautiful, liberal, enlightened idea for a leader like Meiji to do. Not really. Why are Meiji freeing the serfs? They're freeing the serfs to create workers in factories and in mines and on railroads. And what you're going to see in Japan is all the issues that people deal with in industrialized places: overcrowded urban areas, crime, pollution, terrible working conditions, the creation of a new working class group of people, is ultimately just going to happen in Japan too. Peasants are going to be freed so that they can become industrialized workers. The government is going to build railroads, factories, and create mining centers. And here's why the government does it. The government are the only one entity in Japan at this time who could possibly have the amount of capital to build a factory and to build a railroad quickly and overnight as part of a government policy to modernize. If they just waited for the private sector to do all of these things, it would take too long and it would be too late. And one of the things that's really important about understanding Japanese industrialization is it is state sponsored, but it's not run by the state. One of the things that the Japanese realized, and this was a brilliant decision, because you're going to see another place that doesn't do this, is governments do not run businesses well. So this is a problem. We need to industrialize, but we don't do a good job with running businesses. So what do? And it just became policies of the government. We're going to build factories, textile factories in certain key cities. We're going to build railroads in certain key areas. We're going to develop mining centers in certain places. And the government's going to pay for it. And then we're going to sell these things off that the government created, oftentimes at a loss. So say it costs $20 million to build a factory, they'll sell it to a private individual for $10 million. The government will eat the cost of that loss. You might be the decision, well, that's a stupid thing to do. The government's losing money on it. But the government does things to improve infrastructure all the time. If somewhere in America, the government builds a bridge and spends $30 million on it, we don't worry about the cost of that. We just say, we having the bridge because it makes us better and it makes trade more efficient. That was the same attitude. It was totally acceptable to the Japanese to lose this money if the cost of it was to help industrialization. Well, then who's going to run these businesses that are created by the government? and it's the Zaibatsu. The Zaibatsu are private individuals and families that are going to run these mines, these railroads, and these factories that the government created. What's the problem with Japan? They don't have specialized labor. They don't know how to, they don't have workers who are skilled. They don't have workers who are trained. They don't have the ideas. So the Japanese are going to recruit those people from all over the world and encourage them to move to Japan and pay them a better salary than they would have in Germany or in the United States. And this is going to give them the intellectual know-how to how to industrialize and to run these factories. So they're going to recruit Western workers and specialists, and they're going to build these things. They're also going to do what all the other industrial powers do, is try to create a modern military. Overnight, the Japanese are going to try to become a naval power. And why are they building a navy? Because all the cool industrial powers have maritime empires, and they want to have one too. And remember, I told you you're a wolf or a sheep, and Japan is taking the pathway of we want to be a wolf. So, like I said, the Zaibatsu are these business conglomerates run by powerful families that controlled foreign trade and the production of goods. The monopolies were protected. The government wasn't interested in putting like factories in competition with one another after they spent all this time building them. So once you got a Zaibatsu, you were a Zaibatsu. You oftentimes had a monopoly on a certain area in Japanese production, steel production, cotton textile production, whatever it was. And many government leaders, just like in other places, were invested in the Zaibatsu, so they created policies to support the Zaibatsu. Just like Britain created policies to support joint stock companies, because elites were oftentimes invested in those joint stock companies. One famous example of an early Zaibatsu is Mitsubishi. Mitsubishi started off as a cotton textile factory owned by the Mitsubishi family. Nintendo was originally a Zaibatsu that started off making playing cards. So now as time develops, these factories evolve over time, but many of these major Japanese companies that we think about today, their origins come from the reforms of Meiji and early industrialization. This is an example of a Japanese factory built by 1900. This is a cotton textile factory. And my emphasis is it looks just like everywhere else. Massive concentration of labor under one roof. In this one, you see lots of women working. From, I bet you can guess what class of people. That's right, a new worker industrialized class. Is this changing the way that families are organized in Japan? Absolutely. Is this changing societal norms? Absolutely. All the stuff that impacts people in all the other places is going to impact the Japanese people as well. So industrialization is going to lead to these massive shifts in cultural changes and societal changes in Japan, just like what we saw everywhere else. Now, after industrialization occurs, Japan starts to build a maritime empire. They start to conquer neighboring areas. They're going to conquer Korea. If you know anything about the history of Korean and Japanese relations, it's not good, because Japan has attempted, basically for most of the 19th and 20th century, have tried to control and dominate Korea. And there's been some, well, it hasn't been good for the Korean people, and they still hold a grudge about that. If you have a Korean friend, ask their grandmother what they think about the Japanese, and it's very likely you might learn some Korean swear words, which is always a good time. And eventually they start to colonize portions of China. Now, other European industrial powers had started to colonize and take land in China by this point. And the area that the Japanese were taking over in China was putting them in a collision course with another industrial empire that was trying to colonize a certain region of China, and that's Russia. Russia, this huge empire with many more resources and many, many, many more people, and Japan are about to go to war over the same chunk of land in Asia. And this is an example of two maritime empires that are going to be competing and trying to gain access to more resources. The entire world thought in this pending war between the Japanese and Russians that the Russians were going to very easily win. Why? The Russians had more people, the Russians had more resources, but also because of breathtaking racism. Everyone thought there's no way that a bunch of white Christian guys could possibly lose a war to a bunch of non-Christian Asian guys. And racism actually is going to frequently benefit Japan because while they were industrializing, none of the European powers saw them as a threat because of these racist policies. So racism actually benefits Japan because it should have made them a target, and it didn't because none of the industrial powers were really threatened by them. Well, to the surprise of the entire world, the Japanese, using a modern navy, tactics, and better organization, pretty handily defeat the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904/1905. They kind of stomped the Russians, and they quickly overnight became a world power. When this happened, everyone else just kind of looked around and was going, "Wait, what just happened? Huh?" And the Japanese were like, "Yeah, we're a world power now. Thanks for playing, boys." And this is the first major non-European world power we've seen basically since 1492, you could argue. And they had a modern navy backed by the power of industrialization. Now, wait a minute. What is that? Dark, ominous music. In 1905, the Japanese had built a modern navy and was aggressively trying to build an empire. That's not going to be good long term. Now, is it? But none of the issues that happened with Japan in the early parts of the 20th century can happen without the policies of Meiji and state-sponsored industrialization. Just to show you that there is a Japanese empire now. They've conquered neighboring regions. They've conquered many neighboring islands. We're really interested in the stuff right now. They've conquered before 1900. This map kind of extends a little too far, but it was the best thing I could find. So know that by 1900, though, Japan is definitely in the maritime empire business. You can even see they have big chunks of land in mainland China now and Korea. So they're quite a remarkable success story. And it happens really, really, really quickly. And this is how they go from nobody's oral history to world power. 40 years is fundamentally is overnight. Speaking of state-sponsored industrialization, it's now time to talk about the Russians. This is an important group of people in period 4, and we need to know a lot of what causes the crisis and turmoil that we have to look back on. So Russia is an absolute monarchy. They are huge. They're powerful. They practice a form of Christianity called Eastern Orthodox Christianity. So they're not Catholic. They have their own branch of Christianity they believe in. The family that has ruled Russia for hundreds of years is the Romanov family. So the Romanov dynasty has ruled Russia for several hundred years at this point, and they're the absolute monarchs of Russia. It's a totalitarian state. All the power resides in the emperor. They don't allow freedom of speech. They don't allow freedom of press, petition, assembly. They're very harsh on people who want to reform the system. This is not a place where the ideas of the Enlightenment have touched very much. You come out and actively criticize the Tsar, which is their word for Caesar, their absolute monarch, and your life will be short and your death will be slow. That I can promise you. So the rest of Europe looked at Russia as being backwards and a relic. Russia still had feudalism. Most of the people in Russia at the start of period 3 are serfs. They're peasants, and they're the largest forced labor group of people on earth in any one society. There's more serfs than there are Brazilian slaves or slaves in the American South. It's a huge group of forced laborers who are tied to the land of the nobles. And again, we said feudalism is not an optimal system for your country to maximize resources, because all you're really doing is producing food. You're not producing all the other things. Now, in this period, they're going to go massive land expansion, and they're going to take over a chunk of land that basically is the borders of Russia, even in this day. Most of their expansion is eastward. They're going toward the Pacific. In northeastern Russia were many groups of people who were not that different than Amerindians in Europe. I mean, in the Americas, excuse me. Groups of people who lived in hunter-gatherer societies or small groups, and the Russians with modern weapons and diseases just go in and wipe them out, and they incorporate groups of people they've conquered into their political systems. They force those groups of people to become practicing Eastern Orthodox Christians. They're going to force their language on them. This is a process called Russification, trying to Russify these natives. And it should make sense to you that these people who live in northeastern Russia were similar to Native Americans, because where did Native Americans come from? Way back in, tens of thousands of years ago, when Russia and Alaska were connected. The natives walked into Alaska from Russia. That's where Amerindians come from. So this is a group of people who are literally the closest cousins to Amerindians. Some people very similar lives to Aluits, which we sometimes refer to as Eskimos. But by the middle of period 3, large feudal population, large population of people who they've recently conquered, who they're forcing their religion and culture and ideas on, very similar to what Spanish do in the Americas. But they have one problem. For all the land they control, they do not have access to major trade networks. They're not on the Silk Road. They're not on the Indian Ocean. They're not on the transatlantic trade. They're not on the Mediterranean Sea. They're not on the Indian Ocean trade. They're certainly not on Trans-Saharan trade. So what's happening is, despite all this land they have, much of it is really worthless, because they're not getting the interactions that you would need and want with trade with foreign groups of people. And that's part of why they stay feudalist so long. The industrial powers, Britain, Germany, France, the United States, see Russia as being backwards and behind all the way through the middle part of this period. Well, eventually Russia is going to go like, you know what? We have to start catching up. In the 1850s and 1860s, Russia will institute a policy of state-sponsored industrialization, similar to Japan. Just like in Japan, they're going to free peasants. They're going to free their serfs. I think it's 1864 that they free their serfs. It was definitely in the 1860s. Are they freeing the serfs because of these beautiful ideas of the Enlightenment? A little bit. The emperor who freed them was interested in ideas of the Enlightenment. But he also gets assassinated a couple of years later. And the next guy, his brother, who becomes the czar after him, is really just interested in, well, we want to free the serfs because we want to have industrial workers. And this formerly serf class is going to become the industrialized working class in Russia that's going to move to cities and deal with all the crud that industrial workers are going to have to deal with that we've talked about in all these other places. Russia's going to have pollution, crime, worker exploitation, changing role of women, changing family structure, and the workers are going to get low wages, just like in every other place, okay? So that's a similarity to the rest of these industrialized regions. However, the Russians are going to do something that's ultimately going to be kind of catastrophic for them. In the other countries, who industrialized? The private sector. So the people who were directly exploiting the workers were not the government. It was the rich factory bosses. In Japan, yes, the government builds the factories, but they've sold them off to the zaibatsu. It's not directly the government that's exploiting the working class. In Russia, though, there's going to be a big problem. The government attempts to run not all of these factories, but many of them. and to run railroads. So now in Russia, who is exploiting the workers? It's not that rich so-and-so who I don't like, Rockefeller or Mitsubishi or DuPont. It's the actual government itself. There's no split between who's exploiting the labor and the government. It's the same entity. So in Russia, when you're complaining about your way of life and who's causing this for you, you're not complaining about a person. You're complaining about your government. Are you allowed to actively complain against the government in Russia? No. And this is going to be a humongous problem in Russia. We said that in places like the United States, Britain, and France, why wasn't there a workers' revolution in the Industrial Revolution? Because those places gave reforms to workers to allow them to affect change peacefully, and it also did things like free education, ending child labor, or at least a lot of the child labor. It's going to placate the workers, and by the end of this time, worker salaries had gone up, workers were having a better life. In Russia, the Russian government never gives the people an outlet to peacefully affect change, and you also don't even have the right to talk about change, because that would be a threat to the government itself. So what's going to happen is there's going to be this underground movement against the government, and this underground movement is fairly radical. This way of life sucks, and it's the government doing it to us. We need to do something about this. And there's lots of different radical ideas that become popular among the Russians. One of them is a movement called, why am I blanking on the name of what this movement is called? Anarchists. There's a huge anarchy movement. Anarchy believes that the best government is no government, like literally no government. During this time period, anarchists are going to be killing political leaders all over the world. They kill an American president. They also murder a Russian czar. They also murder several members of the Russian government, cabinet position level people. So you got an anarchy problem in Russia, but much more importantly, you have a growing communist movement that's taking place in the underground. They're not having these big communist recruitment meetings in broad daylight, because then the government will crack down and kill everybody. But there's this underground seething in resentment of the way of life and how things are in Russia that is growing with this policy of state-sponsored industrialization. And because governments don't do a great job with running businesses, many of these factories are not being run well. And the Russians go deep into debt to pay for these things. And it doesn't really pay off, and it's not really paying off, at least not quickly. And this is causing huge, huge economic problems in Russia. By the way, how does Russia pay for all these things that they don't have the resources for? They go into debt. Who do they go into debt with? The two most important Western powers, France and Britain. Why is this important? Because if you know anything about what's happening at the beginning of period 4, we're going to start period 4 off with World War I, which is a global catastrophe that could have totally been avoided. Russia, who has basically no political interest at all in anything happening in Britain and France, is going to be forced to have a close-knit relationship with these two states, because they need the capital coming from these states to pay for their industrialization, which is floundering. And that's going to kind of drive the Russians into their arms. Now, the kind of people at AP World History want you to know examples of specific railroads. This is a railroad I want you to know specifically, and this is the Trans-Siberian Railroad. The Trans-Siberian Railroad will be built by the Russians, funded by the government, by tens of thousands of workers in the 1870s, 1880s. It's the longest railroad line ever built. It goes from the Baltic Sea, the capital of Britain, St. Petersburg, all the way to the Pacific. I believe it's over 4,000 miles long. Can you imagine just the amount of time, energy, and resources that you had to spend on a railroad project like this to connect all the parts of Russia industrially. But again, despite its size, it's still not on major patterns of interaction, and they're still falling behind. And the increasingly enlightened ideas are affecting governments in places like Britain, the United States, France, Germany. They're not touching the Russians at all. Okay. Oh, I think I messed the slide up. Okay, guys, so for some reason I have a slide that didn't save, and I need you guys to just understand this kind of closing idea. So Russia's spending all this time, effort, energy, and money on industrialization. It's leading to all the societal changes that are taking place, and it's not really making anybody's life better. And the country's going massively into debt. That's not making their life better. You can see here, this is Manchuria. This is the region that Russia, as they were becoming an empire, wanted to expand into. And we said this is also the region that Japan wants to expand into. And they're going to fight this war. And on top of all this other mess that's going on in Russia, they lose. They lose this war to what's perceived as a little bitty, non-Christian, non-European Japan. How is this possible? And one of the big things you need to know is by the start of this, at the end of this unit, there is a tremendous lack of faith and confidence in the Tsar. What is the claim to power of a Tsar as an absolute monarch? That God has divinely chosen me to lead us. Well, number one, it's hard to believe that God has divinely chosen you to lead anything when the quality of life of your people is so miserable at this point. Secondly, it's really hard to make a claim that the Christian God has divinely appointed you, and then you lose a war to a bunch of non-Christians. That's really, really hard. It's a hard claim to make. And the big picture point of all of this is that there's a crisis and there's a growing underground movement, and it's not looking well for the long-term safety and future of the Russian czars if something doesn't happen. Russia is careening towards a revolution. That's the direction we're going in. And right now I'm just leaving you this in period 3 with, and here's all the elements why. So know these things. We'll talk much more about Russia in period 4 and the successor state to Russia. We'll talk a lot about the Soviet Union and all of that after Christmas. So this was our last industrialization lesson. Stay on. I'll give you guys the work. And hey, you don't have to listen to any of these videos again for like, I don't know, 6 months. So